They laughed at him for 11 years. Called him a fool, a ghost with a shovel, a man who'd lost his mind along with his family and taken to planting trees where God himself hadn't seen fit to grow a blade of grass. Every spring, Amos Dell walked out into that cracked, dying valley with saplings wrapped in wet burlap, and every spring the whole of Pell's Crossing found a new joke to tell over their whiskey. I know, I laughed too. I've got it written down somewhere in my own hand in the ledger I keep, the exact day I called that man a lunatic. But here's the thing nobody in that town understood, and the thing I'd give 10 years off my life to unsay. The old Apache who taught him wasn't teaching him how to grow trees. He was teaching him how to survive the day the whole world caught fire. And that day was coming, we just couldn't smell the smoke yet. So before you decide who the crazy one really was, the man planting shade in a graveyard of dust, or the town that mocked him for it, stay with me. Because I was there. I saw what the trees did when the wind turned red, and I have never in all my years been so ashamed to have been right about a man, and so grateful to have been wrong. This is the story of Amos Dell, and the forest he grew out of grief. The morning it started, I was counting fence posts, which tells you exactly the kind of man I was in those days. 53 posts between the north gate and the wash. I know because I wrote it down. I write everything down, always have, since I was a boy who couldn't sleep unless the day was accounted for, tallied, made to sit still on a page where it couldn't sneak up on me later. Cattle, coin, rainfall, the number of times my brother-in-law lied to my face before noon. If it happened, it went in the ledger. My wife, God rest her, used to say I'd count the stars if the Lord held them steady long enough. I told her I'd tried. Got to 4,000 and change before the coyote started up and threw my figures off. So that morning I was on the fence line with my little book and a stub of pencil, and the sun already sitting on my neck like a hand, when I heard the noise from town. Not a scream, worse than a scream, laughter. A whole crowd of it, rolling up the flat from the direction of Pell's Crossing, and I knew before I turned my horse what it meant. There was only one thing in that valley that could pull half a town out into the heat to laugh together. Amos Dell was planting again. I want you to understand what our valley looked like in the summer of that year. You've seen dry country. You haven't seen this. The Dun River, which the whole crossing was built to drink from, had gone to a string of stagnant pools by June, and by July even those had scabbed over into cracked black mud that the crows walked across without sinking. The grass was gone. The hills stood the color of an old bruise. When the wind came, it didn't cool you, it sanded you, filled your teeth with grit, made a sound in the dead brush like a man rubbing his hands together before bad work. Every rancher in that basin was doing the same arithmetic, and I had it all in my ledger in columns that got uglier by the week. How many head we'd lost, how many we'd have to sell for nothing before winter, and how the winter would finish whatever the drought started. There were nights I lay in bed doing sums in the dark and could not for the life of me make them come out to anything but ruin, spelled plain. And in the middle of all that dying, at the far edge of the flats where the land started to climb toward the Mogollon country, there was a single green smudge. Amos Dell's place. I rode over to see the show because a man will take his entertainment where he finds it, and I'm not proud of that. I'm just telling you how it was. There must have been 30 people gathered on the road below his property. Ranchers, their wives, the Pell boys, old Doc Amberley who delivered half the county and buried the other half. And up the slope, ignoring every one of them, was Amos. He was a spare man, all cord and gristle, gone gray before his time. He wore the same faded shirt he always wore, dark at the back with sweat, and he was down on his knees in the dirt with his hands cupped around a sapling no bigger than a broom handle. Working, just working, like there wasn't a soul watching. Behind him, and this is the part you have to picture, behind him rose the trees he'd already grown. I'd seen them 100 times from a distance, and never once ridden close enough to look. There were maybe 200 of them by then. Cottonwood and willow down low where you'd expect it, but climbing up the slope in a great curving sweep. Junipers and pines and oaks that had no earthly business being there. All of it arranged in a pattern I couldn't read, not straight rows like an orchard, but curves within curves. Arms of green folding around the little cabin at the center like a hand cupping a candle flame against the wind. The whole grove was a shade of living green so violent against that dead country that it hurt to look at, the way a lamp hurts your eyes when you've been sitting in the dark. And it was cool up there. You could feel it from the road. A breath of it came down the slope and touched my face, and it was 10 degrees cooler than the air I'd ridden through, and it smelled, Lord, it smelled of wet earth and sap and green growing things, in a valley where nothing green had grown in 2 years. Nobody remarked on that. Nobody ever did. It was easier to laugh. "Amos," one of the Pell boys hollered. "Amos, you missed a spot. Whole rest of the territory's bone dry, better plant faster." More laughter. Somebody threw a clod of dirt that fell short. Amos didn't look up. He pressed the earth down around his sapling with both hands, gentle, the way you'd tuck a child in, and he reached for the water skin at his side and poured a careful measure at the roots. Not a drop wasted, not a drop. And he moved to the next hole he'd already dug. I had my ledger out. I don't know why. Habit, I suppose. And I wrote, I can see it still, my own cramped hand, July. Dell planting again. Town out to watch. The man is either a saint or he is out of his mind, and I have put my money on mad. I was so sure of that. I want to reach back through the years and take the pencil out of that fool's hand. It was Doc Amberley who told me the first true thing about Amos Dell, and he told it to me that same evening on the ride back, when the laughing was done and the two of us fell into step. "You know why he does it," the old man said. "It wasn't a question." "I know he's touched," I said. Doc was quiet a while. His horse picked its way over the ruts. Then he said, "I birthed the Dell child, did you know that? Little girl, and I was there at the end of her too, and the mother a week behind. Fever came through in the bad year, you were up north then, you missed it. Took the two of them inside of a fortnight, and I could no more stop it than I could stop the sun. I've never seen a man break the way Amos broke." He shook his head. "He dug the graves himself, wouldn't let anyone help. And then he planted a cottonwood at the head of each one, because his wife had loved the sound of the leaves. That's all it was at the start. 2 trees for 2 graves." I didn't have anything to say to that. There aren't words that fit under a thing like it. I've looked. They're not there. "And it should have ended there," Doc went on. 2 trees, a man's grief, we've all seen it. But then the Apache came. That got my attention. What Apache? Old fellow, camped up in the high country off by himself. His people were mostly gone by then, moved on, or worse, you know how it went. But this one stayed, and he'd come down sometimes, quiet, keep to the edges. Folks were scared of him, naturally. Folks are scared of anything they haven't taken the trouble to know. Doc's mouth twisted. But he watched Amos plant those 2 cottonwoods over the graves, and one day he just walked up the slope and sat down next to him. Didn't say a word for the better part of an hour, the way Amos told it. And then he pointed at the ground, and he pointed at the sky, and he said something Amos didn't understand, and he got up and left. And he came back the next day, and the day after that. "Teaching him," I said slowly. "Teaching him," Doc agreed. Chi, his name was near as anyone could pronounce it. Old Chi. Taught that grieving man how to read the land like scripture, where the water runs underground, deep down, where you'd never think to look. How the trees talk to the water and the water talks back. How to shape the earth to catch the rain when it comes so it soaks down instead of running off. How to plant so that each tree shelters the next, and the whole of them together make a. Amos had a word for it. A world. A little world that makes its own weather. Doc glanced at me. "You felt it today. That cool air coming off the slope. That's not a miracle, son. That's an old man's knowledge that we were all too proud to learn." I rode a while in silence, and something turned over in me that I didn't like the feel of. It felt like being wrong. I've never cared for it. "Where's the old Apache now?" I asked. Doc looked straight ahead. "Died 3 winters back, up in his camp alone. Amos found him. Carried him down the mountain on his own back, 2 days it took, and buried him up there in the grove, right alongside the wife and the girl. 3rd Cottonwood. 3 graves now." Doc's voice had gone rough. "So when you laugh at that man planting trees, you understand what you're laughing at. You're laughing at the only 3 headstones he's got, and you're laughing at the last living thing an old Apache left behind him in this world, which is a man who kept his promise." I did not write anything in my ledger that night. Some days you can't make sit still on a page, you just have to carry them. But I'm a slow learner, and I won't pretend otherwise. Knowing a man's grief and respecting his madness are 2 different roads, and it took more than Doc's story to move me from the one to the other. What moved me was the water. It was 3 weeks later, deep in the worst of it. My own well had dropped so low the bucket came up half mud, and I'd taken to hauling from the last river pool 2 miles off, which was going the same way. Every rancher in the basin was in the same fix. There was talk at the crossing that had gone past joking now, hard talk, the kind that comes when scared men start counting the same dwindling thing and doing the arithmetic of who gets it and who doesn't. There had already been 1 fight over a spring box. Somebody'd cut somebody's fence. The valley was drawing tight as a cinch strap, and I could feel, the way you feel whether in a bad tooth, that it was going to snap. And then a boy, the youngest Pell, who wasn't old enough yet to have learned the cruelty of the older ones, came tearing into town on a mule to say that Dell's place had a spring. Not a well, a spring. Water coming up out of the ground on its own, clear and cold in the middle of his grove, where 3 years back there'd been nothing but the same cracked hardpan as everywhere else. I rode out with a dozen others to see if the boy was lying. He wasn't. There it was, low in the heart of the grove where the biggest cottonwood stood, a seep, a little pool no wider than a wagon wheel, black water welling up slow and steady over stones Amos had laid to catch it, and around it the ground gone soft and green and thick with growing things. Ferns. Actual ferns. In our country. The cool came off that place like the open door of an ice house. The men stood around it not saying much. You could see them doing their own arithmetic now, and it had changed. It had gone from the fool and his trees to the fool has water and we don't, and there's an ugliness that comes into men's faces when they cross that particular line, and I saw it come into a few of them right then. Amos came down through the trees. He'd heard the horses. He stood there in his sweat-dark shirt with a spade in his hand, not raised, just held, and he looked at the dozen of us standing around the water. He'd spent 11 years calling up out of the dead ground, and he didn't say a word. Big Tom Rieger was the one who spoke. "That's a lot of water for one man, Dell." "It is," Amos said. First I'd heard his voice in years. It was quiet and level and it did not shake. Took me 11 years to make it that much. "Whole valley's dying," Rieger said, "and you're up here with a private pond." "I'm up here with 3 graves," Amos said, "and the shade I promised them, and yes, the water that came with the shade." He shifted the spade, easy, the way a man does who's not threatening but wants you to remember he's holding it. "She told me it would come. Said the trees pull it up from deep. Said if I planted right and shaped the ground right and waited, that was the hard part, the waiting, the water would rise to meet the roots. And you all watched me do it for 11 years and you laughed. I remember every one of you laughing." He looked slow around the circle, and I'll tell you, when his eyes came to me, I felt it in my spine because I had laughed and it was in my ledger, and he seemed to know it. "So I'll tell you the same thing I'd have told you 11 years ago if you'd asked instead of laughed. The water's not in the ground because I'm lucky. It's in the ground because I did the work you wouldn't. And it can be done anywhere in this valley, by any man willing to spend 11 years and stop being too proud to learn it from an Indian." Nobody moved. Then Amos did a thing I did not expect, and it undid something in me for good. He set down the spade. He picked up a gourd dipper from beside the spring. He filled it, and he held it out to Rieger, the biggest and the meanest of us, the man who just as good as threatened him. "You're thirsty," Amos said. "Drink. There's enough for today. There's enough for all of you today. Water's not the thing I'd fight a man over." I watched Tom Rieger take that dipper. I watched a grown man's face come apart and put itself back together. He drank, and he passed it, and it went around the circle. And when it came to me, I drank the coldest, sweetest water I ever tasted before or since. Water an old Apache had promised and a broken man had spent 11 years earning, and I could not meet Amos Dell's eyes when I handed the dipper on. That was the day I stopped writing him down as mad. I rode home and I opened my ledger and I found the entry from July. "The man is either a saint or he is out of his mind, and I have put my money on mad," and I drew a line through it. Just one clean line. I didn't write anything to replace it. I didn't have the right words yet. I have them now. I'd write, "I was the fool. Every one of us was the fool, and we were about to find out just how badly." Because that evening, when I stepped out onto my porch to watch the sun go down, the sky in the north wasn't red from the sunset. It was red from smoke. And on the wind, faint, under the smell of dust, for the first time in that whole dead summer, I smelled something burning. The fire came down out of the high country on the third day, and by then we all knew it was going to reach us, and there was nothing on God's earth we could do to stop it. I had it in my ledger the way I have everything. Day 1, smoke north, distant. Day 2, smoke closer, wind rising. Day 3. Day 3, I stopped writing for a while, because you can't hold a pencil and fight a fire both, and the fire had come to the point where a man had to choose. You have to understand about drought and fire together. Each one alone is a hard thing. The two of them married is the end of the world in slow motion. 2 years without rain had turned our whole valley into kindling, every dead tree, every dry wash choked with brush, every hillside of cured grass standing there like it had been arranged to burn. And up in the Mogollon country, a dry lightning storm had touched it off. And now a wall of fire a mile wide was walking down toward Pell's, crossing on a wind that had swung around hot and hard out of the north, and it was walking faster than a horse could run. I'd seen grass fires. Every rancher has. You beat them out with wet sacks and you plow a line and you make your peace with losing some grays. This was not that. This was a thing with a color to it. An orange-black boiling wall that threw up towers of smoke you could see the fire climbing inside of. And it made a sound. I'll never forget the sound. A low freight train roar that you felt in the ground through your boots before you were near enough to feel the heat. Deer came down out of the hills ahead of it, and then coyotes, and then rabbits, all of them running together in a truce that told you plainer than any words how bad the thing behind them was. When the predator runs beside the prey, brother, you run too. The crossing came apart the way scared places do. Some folks packed wagons and lit out south, toward the river bed, thinking the wide dry channel might break the fire. Some tried to save their homes, wetting down roofs with the last of their water, which was like spitting into a furnace. Rieger and a crew of the harder men rode out to try and plow a fire break across the flats, and I went with them, because doing something is better than standing still and watching the end come, even when the something is useless. We plowed for 2 hours in air so hot it hurt to breathe, and then we watched the fire jump our line like it wasn't there. Watched a burning tumbleweed the size of a wagon come cartwheeling over on the wind and light the grass 100 yards behind us, and we knew we were beaten, and we ran. And that's when I thought of Amos. I reined up on a rise with the heat pushing at my back, and I looked toward the far edge of the flats, toward the slope where the grove stood, and my heart went into my throat, because the fire was going to reach it. The whole eastern arm of that burning wall was swinging around toward Amos Dell's trees, toward the only green thing in the valley, toward 11 years of a grieving man's work and 3 graves under 3 cottonwoods. And there was Amos. I could just make him out. A tiny dark figure moving toward his trees instead of away, when every other living thing in that country was running the other direction. He was going to try to save it, alone, and it was going to kill him. Here is the morally heavy thing, and I'm going to set it down plain, because I promised you the truth, and the truth includes my own cowardice. I had a choice, right there on that rise. South lay the river bed and what safety there was to be had. East lay Amos and a fire that was going to burn that grove to charcoal and the man with it. And every sane calculation in me, I'm a man of ledgers, remember, a man of columns and sums. Every calculation said ride south. There's nothing you can do for him. One man against a mile of fire is not arithmetic that comes out to anything but 2 dead men instead of 1. I sat there on that rise for what could not have been more than 10 seconds and felt like an hour, and I did the sum, and the sum said save yourself. And then I thought of the dipper. I thought of Amos Dell holding out cold water to a man who'd threatened him, saying water's not the thing I'd fight a man over. I thought of him carrying an old Apache down a mountain on his back for 2 days to keep a promise. I thought of 11 years of being laughed at by men like me, and never once, not once, turning bitter enough to hoard the one thing he had that the rest of us wanted. And I thought, if a man like that dies alone tonight while a man like me rides south to save his own hide, then I don't want the hide. It's not worth the saving. I turned my horse east. I want to tell you I did it bravely. I didn't. I did it sick with fear, my hands shaking on the reins, cursing myself for a fool the whole way, sure I was riding to my death for nothing. Courage isn't the absence of the sum, brother. It's doing the thing after the sums come out against you. That's all it ever was. I don't fully know how I got through the leading edge of it. There's a stretch of that ride I've never been able to set down in the ledger because I don't have it clear, just heat like a wall, and smoke that made a blind man of me, and my horse screaming and refusing and me driving her on through it by main force, and cinders coming down like red snow, and the roar so loud I couldn't have heard my own voice if I'd used it. And then all at once I was through. I'd crossed onto the lower edge of the grove, and the world changed. It was like riding through the door of a church out of a battle. The roar was still there, close and terrible, but around me the air was cooler, damp. The great curving arms of Amos's trees rose up around me, cottonwood and juniper and pine, and the ground beneath them was soft and green and moist. And I understood, in a rush that raised the hair on my arms, that I had ridden into the one place in the whole burning valley where a man might live through the night. Amos was up the slope near the spring, and he was working like 10 men. I want to describe to you what I saw, because this is the thing the town never understood, the thing they laughed at for 11 years, and it was all of it a preparation for exactly this night. That old Apache hadn't been teaching a grieving man to grow shade. He'd been teaching him to build a fortress. And Amos, without ever saying a word to any of us, had built it and had known that a day like this would come, because in that country it always does. The grove wasn't planted in rows. I told you that. Now I saw why. It was planted in a great curving crescent, its back to the north where the fire was coming from, its open arms folding around the cabin and the spring and the 3 graves at the low center. The tallest, toughest trees, the pines, the junipers, the things that hold moisture stood along the outer edge, the windward edge, a living wall. Behind them Amos had dug swales, long curving trenches that ran along the slope, and over 11 years those swales had caught every rain that ever fell and soaked it deep into the ground. And now the whole hillside was a sponge holding water where the rest of the valley held only dust. The ground itself would not burn. It was too wet, too deep-watered, too alive. And along the outer edge Amos had cleared. That was the other half of it. He'd kept the ground beneath the windward trees raked bare of dead brush and fallen needles, year after year, so that when the fire came there'd be nothing on the ground for it to run along and climb up into the crowns. He'd given it nothing to eat. Cheese knowledge, 11 years of a broken man's labor, the town's long laughter. All of it had been this, The whole time, a green arc built against a red flood, and none of us had known it, and I was standing inside it while the world ended outside, and I could have wept. HOLLOWAY, Amos saw me. His face was black with soot, his eyes white in it, and he did not look surprised to see me and did not waste breath on it. You came. Good. Get down here, I need hands. We've got maybe 20 minutes before it hits the north edge and I can't wet the whole windward line alone. I got down. Amos, it's too big, you can't. I can't stop it, he said, hauling a soaked sack out of the spring and shoving it into my arms. You're right. Nobody can stop it. I'm not trying to stop it. He looked at me and there was something in his face, not fear. Something steadier and stranger than fear. I'm trying to survive it. There's a difference, and it's the whole difference, and it's the thing Chi spent 3 winters trying to get through my thick skull. You don't fight the fire. The fire's going to win. You just make yourself a place it can't reach and you let it pass over you. Now come on. We worked. God, how we worked. We wet the windward trees as high as we could throw the water. We beat out cinders where they landed in the soft green ground and tried to catch. We soaked the cabin roof and the ground around the 3 graves. And the fire came on and the roar became a scream, and the heat came up the slope ahead of the flames until I thought my skin would blister. And I looked up once and saw the whole northern sky was fire, a wall of it 300 feet high bearing down on us. And I thought, this is where I die, and I chose it, and it's all right. Amos gripped my shoulder, hard. His mouth was at my ear to be heard over the roar. When it hits the outer trees, he shouted, it's going to look like the end. It's going to sound like the end. The heat's going to be worse than anything you've felt. You are going to want to run, and if you run, you die out there in the open, you die, and here you live. So whatever it does, whatever you see, you get down by the spring with me and you do not run. Can you hold to that? Can you trust the trees? I looked at him. 11 years I'd known this man from a distance and called him mad. And now my life hung on trusting the one thing everyone in the valley had laughed at. And I found that I did trust it completely, the way you trust the ground to hold you up, because I'd drunk the water, and the water had been real. I can hold, I said. And the fire hit the trees. I have tried many times over the years to write down what happened when the fire reached Amos Dell's grove, and I have never once gotten it onto the page in a way that satisfies me, because words are a thing men made, and what I saw was older than words. But I'll try one more time for him. He deserves the trying. The fire hit the north edge of the grove like the sea hitting a cliff, and it reared up, a wall of flame taller than the tallest pine, roaring, throwing heat that drove Amos and me down flat against the wet ground by the spring with our arms over our faces. For one terrible moment I was sure the whole grove would go up like a torch, all 11 years of it, and us with it. The outer trees caught. I saw them catch, the junipers going up in gouts of orange, and the scream of it filled the whole world. And I understood in my bones why every animal in creation runs from this thing. And then the grove did what Amos built it to do. The living wall of trees broke the wind. That was the first thing, and it was everything. A wildfire doesn't just burn, it runs, driven by its own wind, screaming forward on a gale it makes itself. And when that wind slammed into the dense curving wall of Amos's windward trees, it split. It shattered and slowed and lifted, deflected up and over, so that the worst of the fire's fury passed above us instead of through us. A river of flame flowing over the top of the grove like water over a stone, close enough that I felt it pull the breath from my lungs, and yet not touching us, not reaching down into the cool, wet green heart of that place where 2 soot-blackened men lay pressed against the earth beside a spring an old Apache had promised. And the ground would not burn. The swales, the 11 years of caught rain soaked deep, the rake-clean earth beneath the windward trees. The fire came looking for something to eat along the ground and found nothing. No dead brush, no dry needles, no fuel, just wet living soil, and a fire that cannot run along the ground cannot climb into the crowns. and a fire that cannot climb cannot take a forest. The outer trees burned, some of them. Amos lost near 40 trees on that windward edge that night, and he grieved each one after like a friend, but they burned slow, green wood full of water, and they burned as a wall burns, taking the blow so the trees behind them didn't have to, exactly the way Amos said they would. You don't fight the fire. You make a place it can't reach, and you let it pass over you. It passed over us for the better part of an hour lying in the mud by that spring with the world screaming fire a few feet above our heads, breathing through wet cloth, watching the reflection of the flames dance in the black water beside the 3 graves. And then, slow, so slow I didn't dare believe it, the roar began to move past. The fire had spent itself on the north edge and gone flowing around and over, down toward the flats, down toward the crossing, leaving the grove behind it. Leaving us alive. Amos sat up first. His face was black, his eyebrows and half his hair singed away, his hands burned where he'd beaten out cinders barehanded, and he looked around at his grove, at the scorched outer trees still smoking, at the green heart of it standing untouched, at the cabin and the spring and the 3 cottonwoods over 3 graves, all of it whole. And this man who had not wept in front of a soul in 11 years, this man who had endured a whole town's laughter without breaking, put his burned hands over his face and shook. I looked away to give him the privacy of it. That's the only decent thing I did that whole night, and it's small, but I'll take it. When he'd gathered himself, he stood, and he walked to the 3 cottonwoods, and he put one blackened hand flat against the bark of each in turn, the wife, the child, the old Apache, and he said something too quiet for me to hear, and I did not try to hear it. Some accountings are between a man and his dead. They don't go in anyone's ledger. But the fire wasn't done, and neither was the night, and I have to tell you the last of it, because it's the part that shows you who Amos Dell truly was, past the grief and past the genius, down at the bottom where a man's real self lives. The fire went down toward the crossing, and the folks who'd fled south into the dry riverbed, Rieger, and the Pell family and Doc Amberley, and better than 60 souls all told, found out what I'd already learned, that a dry riverbed does not stop a fire that's throwing burning brush 100 yards on the wind. The fire jumped the channel. It got in behind them. And near midnight, out of the smoke and the dark, they came 60 terrified people, on foot and on horseback and in wagons, driven back up out of the burning flats, running from a fire that had cut off every direction but one. The one direction was Amos Dell's grove. They came up the slope to the only green place left in a black and burning valley, to the man they'd laughed at for 11 years, to the water they'd very nearly taken from him by force 3 weeks before, and they stopped at the edge of the trees, and they did not dare come in. Because they knew. Every one of them knew what they'd done to this man and what they'd said and how they'd laughed, and now their lives were in his hands, inside the walls of the thing they'd mocked, and they had no right to ask, and they knew it. Amos walked down to the edge of his grove. I walked beside him. He looked out at those 60 ruined, soot-black, terrified people, the whole town that had spent 11 years calling him crazy, standing there in the firelight afraid to enter the sanctuary he'd built. And here is the morally heavy thing, brother, the one I promised you at the start, and it did not fall on me that night. It fell on him. He could have turned them away. Understand that. He'd have been within every right a man has. His grove could shelter them, the swales, the green heart, the water, but 60 people and their animals crowded into it would trample the soft ground, foul the spring, break the very things that made the place live. He'd spent 11 years and buried 3 people building this ark, and it was his, and these were the people who'd laughed, and there was every reason in the world and every wound in his heart telling him to close the gate. He stood there a long moment. I watched his face. I'll never know all of what crossed it. Then Amos Dell cupped his burned hands around his mouth, and he called out to the town that had mocked him, in a voice gone hoarse from smoke but steady as bedrock. Come in, all of you. Bring the animals to the low pool, mind the young trees, and you keep clear of the 3 cottonwoods at the center. Those are graves, and you'll treat them as graves." He paused, and his voice caught just once and then held. "There's room. There's water. There's enough for everyone tonight. Come in out of the fire." And they came. 60 people who'd laughed at a lunatic walked into the lunatic's grove and lived, because the lunatic had been building them a refuge the whole time they were laughing, and because when the hour came, he opened it to them without making a single one of them beg. I have thought about that night every day of my life since. I have turned it over the way I turn over a column of figures that won't come right, and I've decided that the genius of Amos Dell was never really the trees, or the water, or the old Apache's knowledge of how the land holds the rain, extraordinary as all of that was. Those were just the shape it took. The genius was that a man could lose everything the world can take from a person, his wife, his child, his good name, 11 years to a town's laughter, and instead of growing a wall around his heart, he grew a forest and left the gate open. By morning the fire had burned itself out against the wet flats to the south, and the valley was black from edge to edge. Every ranch gone, every fence gone, my own place gone, all 53 of my counted posts turned to ash. 60 people stood in the one green place left alive and watched the sun come up red through the smoke, and nobody said much, and nobody laughed at anybody ever again. Rieger was the one who finally spoke. He walked up to Amos, this big hard man who'd threatened him over the water, and he took off his hat, burned half to nothing. But he took it off, and he could not get the words out, and Amos put a hand on his shoulder and said, "I know, Tom. Drink some water. We'll talk about the rest when we've rested." I got my ledger out. It had survived in my saddlebag, scorched at the edges. And I sat down by the 3 cottonwoods as the sun climbed, and I turned to a clean page, and I found I could not write the thing I meant to write, which was the whole account of what I'd seen, because it was too large and my hand shook, and the words weren't there, and I don't think they're anywhere. So I wrote just one line, and I have never added to it, and it stands as the truest entry in the whole book. They called him crazy. They were the crazy ones, and I was the worst of them, and he saved us anyway. Amos Dell died 9 years later, an old man, in the shade of trees that had grown taller than the cabin. Half the county came. They planted a 4th cottonwood over him, beside the wife and the child and the old Apache who'd taught him, and the grove is still there. I ride out to it sometimes, though I'm old myself now and it's a hard ride. The water still rises. The leaves still make the sound his wife loved, and when the wind comes through it you can almost hear.